On Tuesday, the Council was briefed on public comments regarding the Attainable Housing Strategies recommended by the Montgomery County Planning Board. A record number of residents attended listening sessions and sent emails, and the vast majority voiced concerns with the Attainable Housing Plan. According to the summary presented by Council staff, they received over 2,000 testimonies for and against it. Twice as many attendees of the listening sessions were against this proposal as were for it. And in the written correspondence to the Council offices, over 5 times as many were against it as supported it. Most of the feedback and concerns mirror the arguments that I've raised over the last few months. A number of council members raised similar concerns during the session. Today, I'd like to remind you of the major concerns with this proposal and explain how the Planning Board used reports to justify rezoning 82% of the single-family homes in the county. First, the Planning Board has never clarified what problem they are trying to solve. Many people who voice support for the plan say they support it because we need more affordable housing. We do. Unfortunately, this plan would not help. But don't take it from me. This is what the Planning Board document says. When asked whether this is about affordable housing, they say no, and this is only about building market rate units. And their plan does not address and did not study many of the other issues, the increased stress on our infrastructure, our traffic, parking, tree cover, stormwater, and flooding in schools. And here's one more gaping hole in the plan and the logic. Park and Planning never addresses the fact that there are over 30,000 units that could start construction tomorrow because they're fully approved and they're sitting in the pipeline. All the owners have to do to start construction is to pull their building permits. They're not pulling their permits. And this whole issue would evaporate if developers did pull the permits and build what they've already approved, but they're not doing it. So if there is demand, why aren't developers responding to it? Is it their price expectations, or is it the wrong housing type? Park and Planning's made a big deal about that. Maybe it's not what people want. And if that's the problem, why doesn't the Park and Planning extinguish the permits for projects that have sat there for a long time and rezone the properties so that the housing that's built there is the housing that people want? Apparently, they have no problem proposing to rezone people's neighborhoods, but rezoning property that was set aside for development that is obviously not happening is apparently off limits. I find that odd. In fact, in response to a question from council member at the council session, council staff was not aware of whether there was information from PEPCO or WSSC about the implications of the increased density on their infrastructure. That information must be central to any conversation. What is the impact of increased density on the neighborhoods? We need answers to these questions and other central questions first. This entire discussion is a distraction to the work that must be done to increase affordable housing. And we're moving forward on a number of affordable housing projects. We've provided record funding for affordable housing in my administration. This week, we broke ground on yet another impressive project, the Chimes, that is led by MHP and supported by the county and a number of other organizations. In just the last 2 fiscal years, more than 2,500 affordable units have either been preserved or produced here. So to repeat, we know there's a problem with housing affordability. We're devoting staff and resources to help address it. Is there more that we can do? Certainly. However, rezoning 82% of the single-family homes will not bring more affordable housing, and if done in this thoughtless manner, it will bring a slew of unintended consequences. So what set all this in motion? What was the impetus for this massive rezoning? It goes back to the deliberations at the regional organization, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, often called COG. COG compiles forecasts for the region, which includes DC, parts of Maryland, and Virginia. They publish long-range cooperative forecasts, estimating population, employment, and household numbers for the region. They do these estimates in 5-year intervals over a 30-year period. For example, the Round 9 forecast covered the period from 2015 to 2045, and the Round 10 forecasts, which we're in right now, cover the period from 2020 to 2050. Each series of forecasts constitutes a round, and each round covers this period of 30 years. Those numbers are compiled based on information from member jurisdictions, including Montgomery County. In 2019, after presentation of the forecasts at COG, It was decided that the forecast numbers for employment would require more housing to be built in order to support the number of jobs, meaning that the original projections for households were too low and the household numbers should be increased to match the projected job growth. That part makes sense. So it was then decided to add additional housing targets, and it was determined that the region needed 100,000 more households by 2045, and 75,000 of them should be created by 2030. Now this is for the entire region, not Montgomery County. The 75,000 households were then allocated among the jurisdictions, and Montgomery County's allocation was an additional 10,000 units. This is the only target that was assigned to Montgomery County in terms of units. They had three criteria for these units. First, at least 320,000 units should be added to the region between 2020 and 2030. That was an additional 75,000 units that was already in the plans. That's where the 75,000 number comes from. Second, 75% of all new housing should be in activity centers or near high-capacity transit. That is how the council and Montgomery County have laid out the master plans for Montgomery County over the next 30 years. And this is a total departure from the master plans we created, because this takes the housing out of the activity centers. And the third point they made was affordability. At least 75% of the new housing units had to be affordable to low and middle income people. On top of knowing the numbers that are projected to come to the region, you also need to know what the Council of Governments told the Planning Board about where those numbers needed to go. There was a lot of question about whether the current zoning in the counties would be able to accommodate this. And this is what Metropolitan Council of Governments actually said. The results of this initial assessment confirmed that the region can accommodate within existing comprehensive plans and zoning significantly more housing than the additional 100,000 units needed. And this is from COG. So here's a number that's telling you that they already know that it can be accommodated in the zoning we had today. A simple way of saying that is you have no need to rezone the county to accommodate the units because you already have the capacity in the existing development. Park and Planning has never mentioned that. The other thing, when they talk about affordability, it gets expanded on. The high cost band in the affordable housing amounts for about 22% of the total housing, and this is housing that's affordable or priced in a range between $2,500 and $3,500. The low cost band is priced in a range between $0 and $1,299, and that's for 38% of the projected residents. And the next band that's projected is for people earning between $1,300 and $100,000, and about half of them are under $75,000. And that total band is 40. So in other words, 78% of the housing has to be affordable at rentals below $2,500, and almost 40% of it has to be affordable at rentals below $1,300. And Park and Planning tells you on their homepage that none of the housing they're planning will be affordable. So there's a major disconnect between what the planning department says and what the planning department knows that they actually need. In all these supporting documents, you can see that they explain what is affordable housing, and they defined it in terms of housing costs per month. But then, in the next round of forecasts, these targets aren't incorporated into the new numbers. You can actually see this on the graph. COG actually reduced the job forecast in the next round, and so the forecasts were reduced for Montgomery County as well. I want to clarify one important thing about the numbers. They're all derived from existing zoning. And when ours and all the other planning departments think the units will actually be built. Master plan that are the basis of zoning and are assumed to be built out over a long-term horizon, no one thinks that master plans will be built out in a couple of years. They always talk about how it'll be 20 or 30 years before the master plans are built out. So normally, if there was unanticipated demand, for example, the assumption that we needed 10,000 more units by 2030 would have been accommodated by COG and the planning agencies simply accelerating what they had projected in the years beyond 2030. And conversely, and I've seen this happen, when population or job growth underperform, they don't get the numbers they expected, they routinely assign the growth to later years. You can see it in this chart that there's a reduction of almost 60,000 jobs in the projected employment numbers for 2030 between 9.2 and the subsequent round 10 forecast. As you can also see, this isn't just a one-year blip. If you follow the lines out, the gap actually grows over the entire period. That means they also should have reduced the number of households expected to come here. A reduction of almost 6,000 households is not enough to accommodate for the job loss. The drop in the households projected does not match the drop in employment. The drop should have actually been greater. But at this point, it's not important. This is not the big issue, but it's just something I want to point out. So from the beginning, they have not been honest about the numbers, how many households we will have, and they've ignored the fact that COG said we have enough capacity in our current plans and zoning, and that the vast majority of the households coming here will need affordable housing. To repeat, we have the zoning in place to accommodate the future growth. No rezoning is needed. We have the affordability if we keep building what we're trying to build now, but even that is not enough to achieve these targets. And we do not solve our affordability problem by rezoning 82% of single-family homes in Montgomery County. And we don't solve it because the planning board was clear that none of the new additional zoning was for affordable housing. In fact, it doesn't even address their admonition that 78% of the new units had to be affordable between rents that were below $2,500 a month and other rents that had to be below $1,300 a month. The only target that was assigned to the county was to add 10,000 units by 2030, and that target was dropped from the round 10 forecast, and the forecast was actually reduced. It goes from 422,000 units down to 416,000 units. The Attainable Housing Plan will not help us produce the affordable housing we need. This housing would be sold all at market rate. Again, I know this because the planning board, the same one recommending attainable housing, told us that that is not going to be affordable housing. And here's their graphic again. Even though the planning board said they are addressing housing targets from the Council of Governments, you can see from the data that they're actually not. They're totally ignoring them. Planning board members have said they're doing this in order to meet the targets, but they don't address the housing costs embedded in the targets, and more fundamentally, they don't tell you that the total projected need is actually decreased. It's a con game. And for anyone thinking we're helping our affordable housing situation by adopting attainable housing strategies, you're just wrong, and that's because you've been misled. Again, before they changed the name of attainable housing, this was pitched as being about affordable housing. But when Park and Planning did their own studies, they found that affordable housing would not be the result of this kind of rezoning. So they changed the name, but not the plan. And attainable was picked because they could assume that most people would take attainable for all as being synonymous with affordable. I would, but that's not what their plan says, as we've pointed out a couple of times now. They knew that most people don't read this stuff, but in saying on their cover page that this was not for affordable housing, just market, no one can be confused, or nobody should be confused about what their actual intent is. At the very least, the planning board needs to begin by defining the problem they're trying to solve and explore potential adverse consequences of their proposed solutions for a problem that doesn't exist. There are many ways to figure out how to get the additional 10,000 units if they were needed, because those units already exist in the plans we've created over the past 20 years. There are also over 30,000 units in the development pipeline, and these projects are approved but not yet built. All they need to do, if you're a developer, to build these projects is simply draw your building permit and you're ready to go. There are no approvals left in the process, so if there was demand, one has to ask why the supply isn't coming forward. Planning board needs to stop misleading people and admit that their solution deliberately ignores the need for affordable housing. It's kind of hard to believe that they would use COG numbers and then ignore the affordable part, but they did it. If you're worried about whether your kids will be able to live here after they graduate from college, and this is something they've been pitching to people, this plan won't help that either. It will only put upward pressure on housing prices. And they need to work with our residents. I'll give an example. I talked to some folks from the Four Corners area who described their experience with the planning board or the planning staff as they were explaining what their plans were for their neighborhood. And unlike attainable housing, where they're talking about duplexes, triplexes, and quads, they were getting an even more aggressive solution, and the building of possibly small apartment buildings or larger apartment buildings, and the removal of over 500 housing units, nothing which had been discussed with the community prior to the planning board having this plan. It was the last meeting, and there was no opportunity to have any kind of meaningful input. This is not the way to go about rezoning the county unless you've already predetermined what you're going to do and there's actually no reason for citizen input. And if I were on the council, I'd be really concerned about having a planning board that doesn't believe there's a role for meaningful citizen input, that the planning board is there to simply rezone the county, and that the planning board and that the council, frankly, is just going to go along with that. I hope that's not the case, but the planning board is certainly proceeding that way. If you're going to have meaningful solutions, it requires serious conversations and dialogue with our residents. They are not the enemy. But it's clear that there's absolutely no reason to rezone most of the county to speed up the delivery of 10,000 units, which is the only target we have. I appreciate the council members who asked many questions about this plan. I hope it leads to careful consideration of the recommendations and that nothing is enacted until all the questions are clearly and carefully answered. That will make this a more transparent process in which residents are truly engaged. That really hasn't happened. I'm consistently impressed with the knowledge, skills, and abilities of our residents. Listening to them and working with them will actually help us make this a better county for all of us.